So let's go back to Acts 2 for a second, and let's begin to look at this passage that gives us a little bit of what was happening, what was taking place in this early church. So Acts 2:42. They devoted themselves, and we talked about that as they leaned all the way in, one of my favorite phrases, they leaned all the way into it. They were really captivated by it in such a way that rather than being distracted or losing focus on other things in life, they were so devoted to this that they leaned all the way into it as a central part of who they were. It says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. And over the last few weeks, we've talked a little bit about this, about the apostles' teaching. We've talked about the idea of fellowship. And so today we come to this idea of breaking bread and prayer. Again, this is a run-on sentence, so you really don't get to have one without the others, okay? So you can't be like, oh, well, I'm all about the teaching aspect, and I like the prayer aspect, but you know what? I don't like other people. I'm not sure about that whole fellowship thing. That feels kind of weird. And then when they're like, and then they broke bread in their homes, and you're like, yeah, I really don't want to hang around with other people around tables. I'll just take my anonymous row. I'm just fine, thank you. This is hard because, again, it's leaning all the way into it. And then there's another aspect of this that's difficult as well, is you could say, well, I like people. I just want to hang out with people. And, that to me is pretty great. I could pass on the Jesus stuff. I'll just take the people part. I'll take the food part. I like food. The food part sounds pretty good. I'm not sure about the praying. And here's what I would say. That's fine. Like, I get that. Because sometimes, and again, we've got a series coming up I want to do called I Like Jesus, I'm Not Sure About Prayer. Because prayer, it can be weird, right? Let's be honest, that some of the stuff about that we learn in church and some of the teaching, it can be a little strange. But what they did was, rather than lean away from it, they leaned into that stuff and something happened. They leaned into the way of Jesus. And the way of Jesus, if we're really going to get that picture, is a life of love, compassion, and grace. Learning to live like Jesus. I like Jesus. I think the world would look a lot different if we learned to live like Jesus. So the apostles' teaching, again, comes back to this idea of learning to live like Jesus. The fellowship piece is learning to say that I can't do this thing on my own. I need the people around me. I have to get past, waves from across the room and get into relationship with other people who help me learn what this thing is all about. And we learn it together. And then we come to this interesting phrase, the breaking of bread. Now, as we get to this phrase this morning, the breaking of bread, it's a phrase that really, depending on your experience, you may have a particular picture in your head of what is taking place. And the reason that some of us may have a picture when we hear the word breaking of bread, we may think of the ritual for thousands of years the church has had that we will celebrate at the conclusion of the message today. That is coming to the Lord's table. That is taking the bread. That is taking the cup. And that is remembering what Christ has done for us on the cross. That is that moment of coming together and remembering that aspect, that important part of our faith. This breaking of bread in this way is sometimes referred to, depending on your tradition you grew up in, communion. Some people have called it the Eucharist. Some people call it the Lord's Supper, but it is a phrase from an act of Jesus. Now, we find this act in different places in the Gospels, in the first 4 books of the New Testament, our Bibles, that tell the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. But it is in a letter by a man named Paul that we find the earliest beginnings of what I think is the ritualistic approach to this phrase and to this action. Paul was born about the same time as Jesus, but he didn't follow Jesus. Instead, Paul was actually a persecutor of people who did follow Jesus. And then one day he had experienced and what really can just be amounted to as an experience with the resurrected Jesus, and that forever changed his life. As I think if any of us have an experience with the resurrected Jesus, that would change our lives. And that's really what this faith thing is about, right? Now, that's a story for another day. That's a teaching for another time and another moment. But what we found here is that in this moment where Paul recognized the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus, the transforming power of Jesus, he just leaned all the way into it. He gave his life to Jesus. He started Jesus-centered communities throughout the entire Roman Empire. And as he did that, he tried to help these communities with how to live out this faith in their context. What does it look like in the place that you are to be Jesus-centered people, to be living out the way of Jesus? And what does that look like? And how does that transformation change you, change the people around you? How does all of that take place? And part of what he did then is he tried to pass on beliefs, he tried to pass on practices of the many churches that he helped start. And one of those practices is described here in the book of Corinthians to a church in the city of Corinth. And here's what he said. Listen to this. He said, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it. He said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" Now, this is one of those really cool, fascinating places. When we go back into these letters, we go back into like the book of Acts, we have to remember that all of this is about a community and a story that is being written. These people are experiencing the birth of the early church all around them. They don't have all of the Gospels. They don't have the stories about the life, death, and the resurrection of Jesus. They don't have the Bible as we know it today with the New Testament. And so what they have is they have these stories that are being passed down from people who had experienced time with Jesus and the teaching of Jesus. And they're passing these stories down to people, and they're saying, "Hey, do you know the story about this? Have you heard this story? Do you know the time that Jesus said this?" And so we have to remember is that when we're reading a lot of these texts and we see some of these stories, these are really provocative moments. These are moments that they're hearing and they're going, "Wait, what did you say Jesus said? Hey, did you guys hear that?" Right? And they're like grabbing people and they're like, tell that story again. And they're like, "Oh yeah, this one time." And they start telling the stories. I mean, imagine that somebody walks in and they're like, "Hey, did you hear about the time that Jesus was flipping tables and whipping people and throwing them out of the temple because they were selling stuff and turning it into like a marketplace?" They're like, "I mean, I heard there was something going on, but tell me more." Right? They're like, "Well, what does that mean?" Right? And then everybody's like, "Well, what does that mean? What does that mean to follow Jesus? What do we do with that?" Right? Because they're trying to figure all of this stuff out. Like, yeah, one time, these people, they were like hard judging this lady. And they were like, "Man, this woman is a sinner. Jesus, she deserves death." And Jesus was like, "Well, I mean, if you guys have never sinned before, I guess go for it." Everybody's like, "Did you guys hear it? Hey, come here. Did you hear this? Did you hear what they said about Jesus?" Like, what if we all lived like that? Could you imagine if we all lived without keeping a record of everybody else's sins and just, focused on our own journey? Man, could you imagine how that would change the world? We should write that down and tell other people about it, right? And all of a sudden they begin to write these gospels and they begin to write these letters, and Paul does that here. And so in this one, he says, "Hey guys, I don't know if you know the story. This is kind of an important one. He says, but one time Jesus was sitting with his followers. And he took this bread and he took this cup and he broke it. He broke that bread in front of them and he said, this is my body that is broken for you. Take this and eat this and do this in remembrance of me. And then he says he took this cup and he drank from it and he said, this is my blood that is poured out for you. He says, when you drink this, do this in remembrance of me. Now, this is, after the life, after the death, after the resurrection of Jesus. And they can look back and they can see what happened to him in the final weeks of his life. They can see the impact that this had on all of them and what this actually means. And so Paul is saying to them, hey, there's something about coming together. There's something about taking this bread, something about taking this cup that is a central aspect of what it means to be the church. But I want you to see what happens, why Paul is talking about this. Because this is the part that I think we easily miss. Why was this practice so important? What happened with this practice that Paul felt the need to address it? And what impact does that have on the kind of church that we should be today? Does that make sense? Because sometimes it's easy just to carve it up and say, well, Paul said this, so we should do this. Instead of going, well, what's he talking about? And why was he talking about it? And why did it seem to matter? And why did these people who are trying to figure out the way of Jesus, why did they need to hear about this in the first place? So let's back up. Let's see what was happening in Corinth that Paul felt the need to address this. 1 Corinthians 11:17. Here's what he says. In the following directives, I have no praise for you. For your meetings do more harm than good. First of all, could you imagine getting this letter? Now, I think the American church could sure use some letters from Paul. I think it'd be great. Because I think he'd be like, what is wrong with you people? What are you doing? And that's sort of what he's doing here. He doesn't pull any punches at all. He looks at these people, and imagine you're reading this, because this is what happens. So you'd gather together, okay, as a community, and somebody would stand up and they'd go, we have received a letter from Paul. And everybody would go, oh, crap. He's about to tear us up. And they'd open this letter, and somebody's reading it, and they say, all right, in the following directives, I have no praise for you. For your meetings do more harm than good. Wow. So you can see how frustrated Paul is what is happening at Corinth. So his description of the Lord's Supper that is about to come in the verses that we read and the verses that follow this crucial conversation come as a result of a breakdown of the barriers at what was happening as they gathered together. There is something wrong with their gatherings, that their gatherings are so broken that Paul is saying, it would just be better if you didn't meet at all, because you're actually hurting the cause of Jesus for each other and the people around you because you do this. So what in the world? What could be happening here? Okay, let's find out. Verse 18. He says, in the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you. And to some extent, I believe it. No doubt there have to be differences among you to show which of you have God's approval. Now, this gets really, really weird. So here's what I want to do. It's helpful to imagine a parenthesis around verse 19. Because Paul has this tendency, and it's super frustrating, but he has this tendency where he interjects random thoughts into his letters. The reason for this is he was probably dictating to someone. So this is probably what he was doing. So he's very similar to me. I think Paul would say, he'd start talking, all of a sudden go, oh, by the way, here, put this in there too. And then he'd go back to what he was talking about. And if you take that and you don't see what's happening there, you can sort of miss the context of what he's trying to say. Now, what he seems to be doing here is, he seems to be pointing to the reality. Look, there are clearly different people in different places in their spiritual journeys in this room. He says, I get it. He says, in the first place, there's different divisions among you. I believe that. Now, parentheses. I get it. There are going to be differences among you. He uses this phrase, God's approval, but the way for us to translate it would be, I get that there are some of you who are maybe a little further along in the spiritual journey. You've worked through some more of this stuff. And the point of that is not to be like, oh, well, we are the learned people over here. We have all of this figured out. Oh, I'm sorry about you peasants over here that haven't quite figured it. That's not the idea at all. They are in the room together, and everybody should be reaching forward and reaching back as we're all walking towards Jesus. That's the point. But there are going to be these realities that people are going to be at different places in their journeys. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to put that parentheses around that idea there and see what he's saying. So now listen to it. In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you. And to some extent, I believe it. For when you are eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. As a result, one person remains hungry and another gets drunk. So do you see what Paul is doing? So this is his point. He's saying, look, there are divisions among you. And then he makes this sort of side remark of, yeah, there's obvious spiritual differences. There's going to be that. But he said, but there's a bigger problem taking place. And that is the division among you that is leading you to gather together. And then a bunch of you decide that you're going to start to eat. And you're going to ignore the fact that not everybody's there. And then he goes, and this leads to some of people coming and being hungry and others getting drunk. Now, when we read this seems a little ridiculous. First of all, if you get drunk with one of these juice cups that we use, our grape juice is clearly fermented. And if you get drunk on this little cup, we've probably created some really strong stuff. I mean, that's pretty impressive. But that's not what's happening here in this passage, right? We can see that in the verse that follows. He says, don't you have homes to eat in? Homes to drink in? Or do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Should I praise you? Certainly not in this matter. So what's happening is that the early church was doing what was described in Acts 2. They broke bread in their homes and they ate together. The picture here is really cool. It's actually like when the early church got together, they treated eating together like Thanksgiving. They were breaking bread. They were slow enough to slow down. They were sharing their thanks for Jesus' life and death and resurrection, what it meant in their lives. The picture is that they were probably sitting at one big table. They were sharing this meal together. And as they're doing it, they were living out a new family formed across all kinds of societal divisions. And I think this is such a huge aspect for us to recognize and for us to see what was taking place. I mean, I think this is so cool because as they're sharing together, as they're eating this meal together, they get to this point, and it doesn't feel like it's an overt like spiritual moment. Like I want everybody to hear how good I pray in this moment, or something like that. It's not an annoying like, sitting at a restaurant and somebody begins to publicly pray really loud and, hey, look at all the spiritual people. That's not what I think is happening. I think they're all sitting together. They're all sharing this meal. And then at some point, somebody says, hey, I'm going to break this bread so we can begin to share it together. Do you guys remember what Paul was teaching us? That if we break this bread, like we should remember his body that was broken for us. And everybody's sitting around the table, kids and adults and whoever else. Yeah. Just a very authentic moment, I think. Hey, as we take this cup together, let's not forget like why we're gathered here. Like this is about what Jesus did for every single person in this room. And they all sit back and they go, man, that's awesome. Like that's what it's supposed to look like. That's how it's supposed to be, but that's not at all what was happening in Corinth. What is most likely happening is that some of the wealthier people who could afford to get there early because they didn't have some of these long jobs that they were at all day. They could come early, and they show up, and they're like, man, that food looks good. And, Frank comes in, and he looks at Tom, and he's like, man, I'm starving. I could eat all day. And he's like, let's go. And they start to gobble it up, and they're eating all the food. And he's like, grab that bread over here. Hey, toss me some of that bread. And he smacks it open, and he starts eating it, and he's eating crazy. Then Charlie walks in, and Charlie's like, oh, give me some of that wine. I'll take some of that. And he's like, and they're like, what? Whoa, slow down. And he's like, oh, Frank, you want some of this. And then all of a sudden what happens is a little bit later, the people who show up that couldn't be there early, that weren't the wealthy people, the people who'd been working in the markets and the fields all day, they walk in, and they're like, what is going on? Paul addresses this because somebody says, hey, Paul, they sent him a letter. We're not sure if this is what's supposed to be happening at these meals. Do you have a problem with this? There's sort of a little tattletale kind of thing going on, but they're like, Paul, we need you to address this because we feel like Tom, Frank, and Charlie are maybe missing the whole point of this Jesus-centered community thing. Would you mind addressing this? And Paul says, yeah, I will. Because you missed the point. And he says, when you come together, some of you are eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. The guy's reading the letter out loud, and he's like, some of you they're like, just read the letter. He's like, I'm just saying there are some people, I don't know who it might be, Frank, right? He goes on and he says, but one person remains hungry. Now look, he gets serious. And he goes on, they're reading the letter. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? I mean, look, you guys have a place to do that. But what you're doing, it's humiliating. So of course I'm not going to praise you for that because that misses the whole point of what this Jesus community is about. So then Paul reminds them what the meal is about. To help us understand what he was actually saying, I want to make a small change in translation here to help us see what is actually going on here. And I want to be clear about this. I'm not making a translation and saying this is Ryan's translation. I'm going to translate this as literal as I possibly can and take the Greek very seriously, even though it's going to sound very funny. But the best way for us to read this is that Paul then moves on and says this. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to y'all. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and he said, this is my body, which is for y'all. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever y'all drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever y'all eat this bread and drink this cup, y'all proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And what Paul is saying is something I've said before. All means all, y'all. And this is the point that he is making. The you in here is not our individualistic singular pronoun. You here is plural. Paul is speaking to the entire church. And if y'all aren't celebrating this together, if y'all aren't having a time where you're breaking down the societal divisions around you, y'all are missing the point and not doing what this thing is supposed to do. And you're not proclaiming the good news of Jesus to the people around you. So then he goes on. And Paul gets really serious, and instead of judging other people, he says, judge yourself. Listen. So then, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and the blood of the Lord. Everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat of the bread and drink from the cup. For those who eat and drink without discerning the body of Christ eat and drink judgment on themselves. Now, this verse has been twisted. It's been used in so many different ways that people are like, well, before you go to the table, you better think about those sins in your heart. Before you go to the table, you better think about the bad stuff you've done. And there's an aspect of that, and I get that, I understand that. But that's not the point that Paul was making. Paul is saying, let me just make it simple. If you don't think everyone has a place at this table, don't come to it. Paul is saying, if you don't think that everybody has a place at this table, just stay in your seat. Paul says, if you don't think that this table is for everyone, then it's not for you. And all you're doing is judging yourself in the meantime. Now, I think that I have harped on inclusion at the table for several months, but this is one of the biggest problems in the church today. This is the Lord's table. This is his supper. He is the host of this meal. He has invited you, me, and everyone to come to this table to experience his love and his grace and his mercy. If we're in the way of someone else coming to this table, we're betraying the very message of Jesus. I mean, you hear that? Like, if we're in the way, if we think we can stand in the way of somebody else's relationship with Jesus, then we are the problem. And Paul said there's a much more beautiful picture to paint. He says, live out the glorious picture of God's church as the barrier-breaking, loving community of Jesus. Welcome everybody to the table and share the story of the good news of Jesus, the never-ending, outward-focused message of God's love. In a very simple phrase, it's this. This table is our physical reminder that all means all, y'all. God, we are so thankful for passages like this that push back on us, that challenge us, that cause us to see that there are aspects within our humanity that are sometimes so broken. We miss the point of the story. We begin to think that maybe we're in some special club, that maybe that we deserve to be at the table more than others around us. But in this moment, just like Jesus, we see tables being flipped. We see that the judgment comes upon the judgers, and that the grace and the compassion and the mercy are to those who feel the most outside. Let us be thankful today as we come to this table to be reminded that we get to belong because you invited us. And it's not our table to say that, oh, you get to come too, but to say that, oh, thank you that I get to come too. And help us to come to this place, discerning and questioning and seeing maybe the ways that some of us might have thought about things and other people. And as we break this bread and we drink this cup, to be reminded that as we break down those barriers, as we welcome all people to this table, that we're proclaiming the goodness of the message of Jesus. His message of love and grace and mercy for this entire world. And it's your name that we pray. Amen.